Welcome to our encounter lesson for February the 9th. Our quarter's theme is A King Forever and Ever. And we're moving out this week of the Psalms and into the Gospel of Matthew. And in the 11th chapter of Matthew, John the Baptist, who's in prison, sends word to Jesus asking this question, are you the Messiah, or should we wait for one to come? So John is wondering about this. Are you going to be the king, or is there someone coming behind you? And we'll get to Jesus' answer to John in a few minutes. But then after John's disciples leave, receiving the answer he gives to them, Jesus then begins to address the crowds. And that's actually where our lesson picks up. So we're going to be in Matthew 11, beginning with verse 7. As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began talking about him to the crowds. What kind of man did you go into the wilderness to see? Was he a weak reed swayed by every breath of wind? And the answer to that question is absolutely not. A weak reed being swayed by putting his finger up to the wind to see which way the wind is blowing is not who John the Baptist was. And Jesus is almost asking a rhetorical question there. And he continues with another rhetorical question. Or were you expecting to see a man dressed in expensive clothes? No. People with expensive clothes live in palaces. Were you looking for a prophet? Yes, and he is more than a prophet. John is the man to whom the scriptures refer when they say, look, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you, and he will prepare your way before you. I tell you the truth, of all who have ever lived, none is greater than John the Baptist. Yet even the least person in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he is. And from the time John the Baptist began preaching until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and violent people are attacking it. And our evidence, obviously, for that is that John the Baptist is in prison at this moment as Jesus is speaking. So he continues, for before John came, all the prophets and the law of Moses looked forward to this present time. And if you're willing to accept what I say, he is Elijah, the one the prophets said would come. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. And so what Jesus is saying is all of history has been moving up to this very moment. And essentially when he says that John is the greatest who's ever lived, but he's even not greater than the least of those in the kingdom of heaven, is that there is this huge epical change happening. And John is the greatest up to now, but then past now there will be others who will be even greater than he, because they will be part of the true kingdom of heaven. Reminds me a little bit of a book I'm reading on the history of horses and human beings. Horses have been a part of human beings' lives for thousands and thousands of years. And for thousands of those thousands of years, most of human history, horses were our primary vehicles, and they also were our primary engines. And so if we wanted to go somewhere, it was going to be on horseback or being pulled in a chariot or in a cart. If we needed an engine to take something somewhere, they would pull a cart. They also pulled mills, and so they were the engines that would drive grist mills or drive sawmills and all kinds of things. Horses were our transportation and our engines. And then along comes the internal combustion engine and the automobile. And almost literally overnight, things change. I'm going to show you a picture now of, or two pictures of New York City. The first there on the left is New York City, 5th Avenue in Easter morning of 1900. And it says, can you spot the automobile? And if you can see that little red circle there, there's one automobile. Everything else on the street is horses. And then 13 years later, just a blink of the eye almost, here's 5th Avenue, Easter morning, New York City, full of cars, and there's one sole horse there in the middle. Everything changed. So Jesus is kind of saying the greatest horse rider of all in 1900 is going to be the least of those in 1913, just a few years later, if we use this analogy. Everything is changing. Now here's why John the Baptist and the people are confused. They are looking for a Messiah who's going to be a warrior king, who's going to come in and wipe out the Romans and come in and establish this earthly kingdom. And Jesus, instead, the Messiah, comes to establish a heavenly kingdom. And rather than wielding a sword, he says that those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And rather than wreaking vengeance, he says that we're going to pray for our enemies and love those who persecute us. He's totally transformed transforming things. The kingdom of heaven is going to be something like we cannot imagine, just like those people in New York City could not possibly imagine what a difference just 13 years would make. And yet the change was coming, and it was going to happen. And yet, I'm sure it was true in New York at that time. The people that were breeding horses, the people that were making horses and carriages and buggies probably couldn't imagine what was going to happen. They didn't realize that they were kind of being replaced, and probably right up almost until the end, until they maybe went bankrupt. They weren't able to admit it or believe it. We tend to believe what we want to believe, and Jesus recognizes this. And so, although this isn't our lesson, I want to cover it a little bit. He goes forward. And he says, after he says these things about how John the Baptist and the coming of the kingdom of heaven, he says, "To what can I compare this generation? It's like children playing a game in the public square. They complain to their friends, 'We played wedding songs and you didn't dance. So we played funeral songs and you didn't mourn. For John didn't spend his time eating and drinking, and you say he's possessed by a demon. The Son of Man, on the other hand, feasts and drinks, and you say he's a glutton and a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and other sinners. But wisdom is shown to be right by its results.'" And let me confess a little bit. One of the things that I've noticed about the internet that I'm guilty of is if I'm looking for a particular answer to some question, I tend to browse and search and Google until I find the answer that I want. The one I wanted to begin all along. I'm working right now trying to decide when I need to plant grass seed in our pastures. And I have a time when I'd like to do it. And so I keep searching until I find somebody who says this is the right time to do it. And maybe that's the right answer, and maybe it's not. Sometimes rather than searching for the truth, I'm searching for somebody to tell me what I want to hear. That is, I think, one of the reasons that our country is so polarized right now. We tend to live in these information silos, and we only get our information from maybe the sources that are telling us what we want to hear. And if we aren't willing to listen to other sources, we may miss the truth. And we get what we hear, but we miss the truth. That's what Jesus is saying. You're like a bunch of children who say, "Well, I played a wedding march and you wouldn't dance, and so I played a funeral march and you wouldn't mourn. John the Baptist comes and he lives a very austere life, and that's not what you were looking for in a forerunner to the Messiah. And so you say he must have a demon. And then I come and I'm the opposite, apparently, because I feast and I drink, and you say I'm a glutton and a drunkard." You're just looking for what you want, and in doing so, you're going to miss the truth. But Jesus says, wisdom is to be shown by its results. Eugene Peterson translates this in a wonderful way that I think helps us understand this completely. He says, "Opinion polls don't count for much, do they? The proof of the pudding is in the eating." It's one thing to say, "I've baked or made a wonderful pudding," but it's not until we taste it that we really know. So wisdom is shown to be right by its results. And Jesus has been demonstrating throughout Matthew, in both word and deed, his power. He has performed deeds of power, and he's going to talk about those in just a moment all over. When John the Baptist asks Jesus, "Well, are you the one to come, or should we wait for another?" Jesus' answer is, "Go back and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the good news is being preached to the poor." And that, of course, is a prophecy coming from Isaiah as how we would recognize the Messiah. All of this stuff is happening, and so the proof is in the pudding, as Eugene Peterson would translate it, perhaps. What do you think, John? If all of this is happening, has the Messiah arrived? Am I the Messiah, or should you wait for another? Now next, Jesus pronounces woes on Chorazin, Bethsaida, and Capernaum, three cities that were Jewish cities where he had done most of his deeds of power in, and yet they have not believed. And so Jesus says, it's going to be worse for you than Sodom and Gomorrah because you didn't believe. And he says that had he done such deeds of power in Tyre and Sidon, and those were Roman Gentile cities, he said they would have responded positively. But woe to you because you haven't. The very people who should have seen that their long wait for the Messiah was over are missing it. Now I think it's really important that we note that when he says, woe to you, he doesn't do this in anger. This is not a vindictiveness. Boy, I can't wait to see you get what's coming to you. It's really quite the opposite. The woe there in Greek is a statement of sorrowful pity because you're not listening and you're not paying attention, and it's going to go badly for you, and I don't want it to go badly for you. In the Cotton Patch Gospel musical that Harry Chapin wrote, he has when Judas kisses Jesus and betrays him, Jesus says, "Did you just kiss the Son of Man goodbye? Oh, buddy, do you realize what you have just started?" So often we see Jesus' response to Judas as being angry or vindictive, but Jesus is heartbroken that Judas has chosen to do this, just as Jesus is heartbroken when we violate his will, because what we do is not only make it harder for him, and Judas is turning him over to the authorities to be killed, but even worse for us, it makes it hard on us. And of course, Judas's life will soon be over because of this. Oh, buddy, do you realize what you have just started? And I think Jesus says that to us so many times in our lives. Woe to you. Oh, buddy, do you realize what you've just done? When parents punish their children or have to watch their children suffer the consequences of their sins or of their bad choices, there may be anger, but the anger is often anger of fear. You know, now you're going to have to suffer for what you've done. I have to punish you, or you have to suffer for disobeying me, because there are consequences to that, and I don't want to see that. Woe be to you. Oh, buddy, what have you done? It didn't have to be that way if only you had listened and obeyed. And that is what Jesus is driving at here. He is going to be a Messiah unlike that anybody expected. The change is even greater than the change from horses to automobiles, and yet we should have seen it coming. It was there in the prophecy. It was there in Isaiah. We should be able to see it in the deeds of power that he does, in the grace that he offers, in the teaching that he offers. And yet if we don't want to see it, we close our eyes to it, and it is woe be to us for missing that. And so before we judge Chorazin and Bethsaida and Capernaum for their unbelief, I think we should examine ourselves. One of the unintended consequences of the great revivals that swept across our nation in centuries past was that we developed this idea of evangelism, that evangelism is getting somebody to pray a prayer, accepting Jesus into their heart, and then they secure their spot in heaven, and then we kind of move on to the next person. We did a great job of evangelism and a terrible job of discipleship, and we set up this system where people think, well, as long as I now have my spot reserved in heaven, it doesn't really matter what I do on earth, and I'm just basically waiting until I die to claim what is coming for me. I sometimes compare it to fire insurance. I have fire insurance on my house, and I hope I never have to use it, but if my house were to catch fire, then I know I have that insurance to restore the house. It's almost like we see salvation as fire insurance from hell, and now I've got that, and I just wait until I die, and when I die, I cash in the policy, and I'm restored. But that's not what Jesus is doing. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is here among you now, and the kingdom of heaven is going to be revealed. The wisdom will be revealed by the results. The proof will be in the pudding. And earlier in chapter 7, Jesus warns us to beware of false prophets. And he says that all of us, false prophets and others, are judged by their fruits. What fruit do you bear? Paul in Galatians then helps us, and he shows us, well, what does it mean? What is the fruit of the Spirit? And Paul tells us it's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. If we're looking to a leader, before we call them a false prophet or before we anoint them a prophet, let us ask, do they bear in their lives love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, or do they not? And then let us look into our own lives. It's not enough for me to say, way back when at some point I made a profession of faith and I accepted Christ, and now I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Jesus. I may well be, have my place reserved in heaven, but am I really following Jesus? Am I really in the kingdom? Or is it woe upon me? And how do I know? Well, I have to do that hard examination. Is there love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control in my life? And so I would ask you now, which ones of these fruit do you think you are bearing in your life? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And which ones are missing from your life? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. The wonderful news, good news of the gospel is you don't have to generate that in your own. They are the fruit of the Spirit. When we accept Jesus, when we put ourselves underneath the teachings of Jesus and underneath the power of Jesus, some of the deeds of power that Jesus does is gives those to us as gifts. We simply have to open ourselves up and accept them, and then we have to live them out. And one of the ways I think that we live them out is by practicing. We practice love, we practice joy, we practice peace, being peacemakers, and we practice kindness and all of those other things. And when we practice them, we get better at them, just as an athlete practices and gets better at his sport, or someone who is an artist, or someone who is doing some other endeavor. We have to practice to get better. But the gifts come from the Holy Spirit. They don't have to be generated from within us. Matthew 11 ends, and this is again outside of the scope of our passage, but I think we need to hear this wonderful invitation that Jesus makes to us. Then Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." Let us accept Jesus' invitation to learn from him, for he is humble and gentle at heart. Let us take his yoke upon us, for his burden is light and his yoke is easy. Thanks be to God. Amen.